Well, hello and welcome. I'm Nicole Springer, Vice President of Professional Development and Inclusive Excellence for Campus Compact. Thank you for joining us for this fifth webinar for one of Campus Compact's newest Rutledge publications in partnership with AAC&U, Exploring Equitable Community Campus Relationships. Today's session focuses on the lessons learned through tensions and obstacles. So I'll now hand things over to Dr. Sarah Moore, who will facilitate today's session.
Thanks so much, Nicole. Hi, everyone. As Nicole said, my name is Sarah Moore, and I am a sociology professor at Salem State University in Salem, Massachusetts, and I am one of the co-editors for this volume. As Nicole said, today we're going to be talking about lessons learned through tensions and obstacles. So we're going to be hearing from two author teams. They're going to be talking about some of the lessons that they learned through some of the challenging experiences and moments in their respective projects. Before we jump in, I just wanted to share a little bit about the volume. So this is a volume co-published by Rutledge, AAC&U, and Campus Compact, and it just came out last December. The title is Exploring Equitable Community Campus Relationships, and we have a fabulous editorial team. I think I saw Karla was here. I'm not sure if anybody else is on today, but we have Karla Bird at the University of Montana, Suchitra Gururaj at the University of Texas at Austin, myself, again, from Salem State in Massachusetts, Andrea Robles, who's with AmeriCorps, and Cindy Vincent-Clark with Boston University. So each of us brought a different set of lived experience and professional experience together in editing this volume, and it's been really a fascinating and really exciting opportunity to hear about people's projects from all across the United States. And we have some international projects as well. For folks who maybe have not attended previous webinar sessions, just to provide a little bit of context, this book examines community campus experiences that these different teams have in creating and maintaining equitable community engaged relationships in teaching, research, and in practice. It was important for us to give folks an opportunity to think about what we mean by equity. We use that word a lot, and we know through editing this volume that our different teams define equity in different ways and examine different aspects of equity in different ways. And so we were really excited to put together a volume that would allow us to interrogate that idea a little bit. We have 5 different sections of the book, and so the contributions focus on a few different areas when it comes to equity and community engagement. Frameworks that folks used in framing their projects and their work with community partners, values and principles that guided their work, relationship building and co-design practices, tensions and obstacles, which we'll be talking about today. And then our next webinar will focus on institutionalization and sustainability when it comes to these kinds of community engaged projects. Just as a quick note, you can see on the right-hand side, if you scan that QR code, you'll get a 20% discount with that code for anybody who might be interested in purchasing the book. So again, just a quick note, this map shows all of the different places where our contributing teams are doing their work, their projects. And we also have a group that's not on the map in Taiwan, for example. So we have a group in Alaska. It's not represented here either, just because we have limited space. But you can just see like how varied these different geographic locations are. And it's also worth mentioning that the topic areas, whether it is community development or healthcare or climate justice or food insecurity or arts and culture, right? There's real diversity among our author teams in that regard. Also, quite a bit of diversity among our author teams in terms of the kinds of institutions that they're coming from. Land grant institutions, R1 institutions, HBCUs, right? So there are lots of different kinds of institutions represented as well. So what I'm hoping to do to sort of set this up is to talk just very briefly about the chapters that are in this particular section. We have 4, and again, of those 4, we have 2 groups here to talk with us today. I want to highlight a few of the themes that in editing this particular section I found particularly meaningful. And then I'm going to turn it over to our author teams to talk about their work. So in this section, again, we have 4 chapters. The first chapter is Dancing Toward Equity, Decolonizing Land Grant Engagement with Indigenous Communities. And this author team is Ronald Orchard, Andrew Pearl, and Dion LaPointe. And this particular team describes how Kansas State College's Kansas State's College of Veterinary Medicine has piloted through the kind of fraught history of land grant institutions and the displacement of Indigenous communities by establishing a community campus partnership that's built on shared authority. Their work continues to prioritize the lived experiences and interests of Indigenous community partners. The second chapter, Equity and Belonging in Community Archiving, the Arkansas Chinese Heritage Project, was written by Emerald Dunn and Zach Smith, who are both here with us today. And this team explores the legacy of silence among Chinese immigrants in the Arkansas Delta as they encounter challenges collecting oral histories from historically marginalized groups. By focusing on stories of community rather than stories of exclusion, sort of pivoting that framework a little bit, they found ways to critically examine this history and really created a repository of narratives that illuminate the region's often forgotten history. And I will say, on a personal note, this was not a history that I was really aware of at all. And so this was a very eye-opening chapter. The next chapter is Navigating Power, Equity, and Co-Creation in a Community University Partnership. Critical reflections on the long-term relationship between the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative and Tufts University. And we have 2 of these co-authors joining us today. This team included Penn Lowe, Zoe Ackerman, Jocelyn Fidalgo, Minnie McMahon, and John Smith. This team puts forth an equity-based research model that I expect they'll be talking about today that guides their community campus partnerships around public land trusts. They articulate the importance of institutionalized, codified agreements between universities and communities, but they recognize that human beings are still enacting these agreements, which means reflection and communication are necessary for ongoing collaboration. And I really like this chapter, especially because it sort of bridges the tensions and obstacles piece, but then also because this is such a long-term partnership, there's a lot there in terms of institutionalization and sustainability. So in a lot of ways, I think this chapter kind of bridges today's webinar and our next webinar. And then our final chapter is From Students to Partners, Negotiating Equity in Community Engagement Projects between first-year college students and early career professional community partners. And this co-author team includes Jake Kerchak, Maggie Baker, Katie Maloney, Max Ellenbecker, Catlin Wolf, Helisa Seder Texera, and Drew Dyers. And this team describes the institutionalization of a curricular learning experience for first-year students that really necessitated clear communication and revised leadership structures to limit the negative impacts of student engagement on community partners. So this was a particularly interesting chapter because it focused on community engagement as embedded in a particular curriculum. So I think a pretty interesting chapter. In terms of the section in general, it's worth noting a couple of things. So, one thing that really came through all of these chapters is that tensions and obstacles are inevitable in community and campus partnerships. And at the same time, they create opportunities for learning, growth, and stronger collaboration. Our editorial team, as we put this book together and as we thought about what the goals of this volume should be, we really wanted people to give us their messy stories too. We know that community engagement can be quite messy and complicated. And oftentimes, especially for those of you who are in academia like I am, we're often encouraged to not focus on that messiness, right? And really put forward our best stories. And we really wanted this volume to engage with that messiness a little bit because so much learning happens whenever things get messy and complicated. So we thought that was really important, and these chapters address that. Challenges often stem from historical marginalization, limited resources, and institutional constraints. These chapters talk about ways in which particular community histories have shaped relationships between academic and community partners. We also know, for those of you in higher education, which I'm assuming is probably most of us on this webinar today, that we all operate also within institutional constraints. So how do we sort of navigate those things, right? Those fraught histories, and then also those institutional challenges. These chapters also show how partners navigate difficult histories, and they navigate these histories by amplifying community narratives and knowledge. So in all of these chapters, you really get the sense that community experience, lived experience, expertise, and knowledge are really elevated, amplified and elevated. This particular collection of chapters also emphasize the need for clear communication, shared authority, and adaptable institutional practices in sustaining partnerships. Again, something that will sort of bridge what we're talking about today and what we'll be talking about in the next webinar. And then lastly, and I think really importantly for anybody doing this work, these chapters highlight the importance of humility, reflection, and flexibility. They are essential for advancing equitable community engagement. And I think that's something that in previous webinars we've talked about as well, just in thinking about how people approach the community engaged work that they do. And humility, reflection, and flexibility are so important. You'll also hear in these chapters a number of sort of strategies for developing the equitable, meaningful and equitable partnerships. These are treating tensions and obstacles as learning opportunities rather than things to sort of be afraid of or back away from. Confronting historical harms directly rather than acting as though they didn't exist, right? I'm a sociologist, so I think a lot about the ways in which history shapes our lived experience, and we really, to do meaningful work, have to grapple with that directly. Centering community authority when histories are fraught, again, really elevating the voices of people who may have been historically marginalized, and really amplifying their histories and their stories. And then adapting university systems to community realities. These chapters, talk about ways in which there is sometimes a disconnect between resources, timelines, power structures, right? Between university and community partners. And so these chapters, in their own different ways, talk about ways that sort of academic spaces can adapt to community needs, priorities, timelines, which I think is really fascinating. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Emmy and Zach to talk about the Arkansas Chinese Heritage Project.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah, just for inviting me, and thank you so much for editing and helping get this chapter into the book, and really just putting us in touch with all these other exciting projects. I'm going to share my screen, but I want to know, like, are you all getting the full screen or the presenter view?
Full screen.
Yes, full
Okay,
screen.
excellent. Um, So I want to start off by briefly introducing myself and my community partner. So my name is Zach Smith. I teach in the history department at the University of Central Arkansas, which is a teaching-focused institution, baseline 4.4. And I also direct our interdisciplinary Asian Studies minor program. And I've had the great privilege to work for the last 3 or so years on the Arkansas Chinese Heritage Project with Emerald Dunn. So Emmy, would you mind introducing yourself too?
Thank you, Zach. I'm Emmy Dunn. I am independent researcher, and I learned recently, well, since working with Zach, that I am a community historian, and also I am a co-producer of a documentary called Bluff City Chinese that is based on the history that I uncovered about the Chinese in Memphis.
Awesome. Thanks, Emmy. And y'all should definitely check out Bluff City Chinese. It is an incredible film, and I think a testament to the importance of kind of community-based research. So yeah, I kind of, as Sarah mentioned, I was actually quite similar to her. Despite being trained as a historian of modern China, prior to working at an Arkansas-based institution, I was also largely ignorant of the long history of Chinese communities in the South. But indeed, despite being left out of mainstream historical narratives, both Asian American narratives and histories of the South, Chinese communities have resided in Arkansas for over 150 years. Chinese farm laborers were initially recruited to the Mississippi Delta region in the immediate aftermath of the Civil War. And although many of those Chinese laborers left the farms after their contracts concluded, subsequent generations navigated Chinese exclusion laws and racial discrimination to eventually carve out a really important economic niche operating small grocery stores, predominantly serving African American communities in the otherwise deeply segregated towns of the U.S. South. Um, a lot of my students recently have seen the film Sinners, directed by Ryan Coogler, which features a Chinese American family who runs a grocery store that's very much reflective of this history. While these grocery stores were once a really sort of dominant feature of the Delta landscape, serving as gathering places for farm workers at the end of a long week, or launching points for new businesses, or of course, a crucial means of livelihood for supporting the next generation of Chinese Arkansans. Due to a variety of factors, including declining rural populations, competition from, Safeway and Dollar General, and just subsequent generations seeking professional degrees and oftentimes leaving the state, almost all of these grocery stores have since closed. And the generation that grew up in the grocery stores is now entering their 70s, 80s, and 90s. And in a lot of ways, this vital part of Chinese American history and Arkansas history is in danger of being lost. So in 2023, I was invited to attend a gathering of the Chinese Association of Arkansas, a group that was actually first founded in the 1940s to serve the interest of Chinese merchants. And it was here that I met Emmy, who shared some of her research on the early history of Chinese communities in Memphis, as well as some representatives from the Mississippi Delta Chinese Historical Museum, based out of Cleveland, Mississippi. And what really emerged from this meeting is that there was a vital need to collect, preserve, and showcase the histories of Chinese communities in the Delta before it was too late. So we pretty much within a few months of that meeting Emmy, myself, and two local community members, Ping Fong Jr. And his wife, Lucy Jo Fong, worked to co-found the Arkansas Chinese Heritage Project, which was designed from the beginning as an explicit partnership between UCA's Center for Asian Languages and Cultures and the Chinese Association of Arkansas. I think one of the things that really distinguished this project from the beginning is that it was designed to be a kind of community based effort. And so I kind of wanted to ask Emmy to talk a little bit about sort of what some of the community goals for the project were and how we went about our work.
Yes. So one thing that I found out from doing my research prior to working with Zach is the invisibility of the Chinese community. So many people do not realize that there is a Chinese enclave or Chinese community in the Mid-South uh, because it's overpowered by the Chinatowns both on the West and East Coast. So that was why I was interested in doing the documentary to highlight the Chinese in the Mid-South. And so this was a goal for the Arkansas Chinese Heritage Project is to bring visibility to the Chinese community, to bring equity, to highlight their voices and how they contributed to the community.
Thanks, Emmy.
So,
I also just want to point out too how much Emmy's independent genealogical research has been central to this project. Emmy's work was central in both putting us in touch with people to interview for the project. Oftentimes, to prepare for interviews, I or students would look at genealogical research that Emmy had done. Many times, we actually also then gave these genealogical histories to the interviewees as a kind of gift and to respect their time that they were giving to the project. So I want to talk very briefly about some of the outcomes of the project, and then we can share some of those tensions and obstacles. So since kind of founding the project in 2023, we've conducted about 26 life story interviews, often between 1 and 2 hours, but totaling about 35 total hours of recorded oral history. We've digitized hundreds of photographs, and starting in 2025, began accessioning physical artifacts through a partnership with the UCA Archives. Um, we have been the beneficiaries of several kind of key grants from the Mellon Foundation and Asia Network. But I want to sort of really emphasize here that um, this project only exists because of community support. Not only have community members also kind of stepped up to contribute financially to the project, but any story or artifact or photograph that we were able to showcase through this project is only possible because oftentimes community members, family historians have held on to this material for decades. And it is really on a foundation of community-led history in the absence of any kind of institutional archival library or university support that any of this history is even recoverable. So in 2025, we launched a public-facing website, arkansaschineseheritage.org. I would definitely encourage folks to check it out. It contains a lot of oral history interviews with life stories, photo archives, video clips where you can hear people in their own voice talk about their experiences, as well as select digital exhibits focused on particular themes and resources for K through 12 teachers. We want to kind of change the way that Arkansas history is taught. And then, in fact, since the publication of the book with Rutledge, we've also expanded to launch several museum exhibits. In March of this year, we launched a special exhibit at the Plantation Agriculture Museum on the Arkansas Delta Chinese. This was a collaboration with students working with community co-educators to develop an exhibit kind of showcasing both the immigration pathways and the grocery store experiences and kind of cultural practices and community relationships of Chinese Arkansans. We've also established a permanent gallery, kind of making use of university space to highlight this history at Schiestel Hall on UCA's campus, and that launched in April. So I want to talk a little bit about kind of the main bulk of today's event, go through some of the tensions, obstacles, and lessons learned. As Sarah mentioned in her introduction, one of the primary obstacles is a kind of broader legacy of silence. One of the things that we heard repeatedly from our interviewees is that oftentimes their parents, that is the kind of first generation Chinese immigrants to Arkansas, often told them very little about their early experiences in the United States or about their previous histories in southeastern China. Sometimes this was a kind of strategy of survival. In many cases, early Chinese immigrants to Arkansas during the period of exclusion came over as paper sons or daughters, essentially with fictive kinship relationships that were established to circumvent the Chinese exclusion laws. Um, Other times, there's simply been community members who have felt that previous academic efforts to represent the Chinese in the South have fallen short. And there's a little bit of a legacy of distrust that I think we had to kind of overcome with our project before people were willing to participate. There's also, of course, the challenge of working with aging and dispersed communities. As I mentioned before, many of the communities most central to our project, whose families arrived in Arkansas prior to 1965, are now themselves in their 80s or 90s. In order to, be respectful of the constraints on those community members, we often traveled to interview people in their homes, kind of throughout the state. So we put a lot of miles on the car. Emmy and I have had many long conversations about the meaning of life while driving around in the Arkansas Delta. But it also has meant recording sometimes in non-ideal locations. During the summertime, a lot of air conditioners are blaring in southern Arkansas. But it's also meant, I think, working with generations of folks who aren't necessarily digital natives, making sure that we discuss consent agreements in person, making sure that everyone kind of understands the extent of their participation. Probably, though, the most challenging obstacle has been, I think, this issue of kind of balancing what have traditionally been an academic goal or interest in issues of racial identity and confronting kind of anti-AAPI racism, and a sort of community interest that is much more focused on kind of personal history or family genealogy or community networking, are stories of success. One of the things that we found in providing a platform for community members to tell their own stories is that many individuals oftentimes didn't want to necessarily dwell on issues of prejudice or discrimination. And while I think as a sort of social justice oriented oral history project, we never would want to ignore that prejudice or discrimination occurred. Of course it did. But we also want to make sure that we tell stories that leave room for joy, for belonging, for narratives of community success that I think have been really kind of marginalized by previous histories that only want to tell sort of stories of racial trauma in the South. Um, a, a final sort of challenge is simply the changing funding landscape. We were actually originally founded as an initiative of UCA's Center for Chinese Language and Culture. But since founding the project, the Arkansas State Legislature, we are a public university, passed a law forbidding any public universities of even having a Chinese cultural center. This forced our Chinese center to close, and we had to very quickly kind of pivot to alternate funding models to keep the program going before sort of relaunching a Center for Asian Languages and Cultures in the recent past. And then a final challenge is simply the sort of need to develop diverse skill sets. I was very new to oral history and videography and Arkansas history and social media and web development before this project. And I have benefited enormously from many teachers. Emmy has been my Chinese American history teacher for the past 3 years. And it's really only to her expertise and to the expertise of other community members that we've been able to do this. And so I can end with a couple of quick lessons learned, but I guess, Emmy, did you want to discuss any other kind of challenges or obstacles?
No, I think that's good. That's good.
Okay. I guess I would just say too, in terms of kind of lessons, I would offer two really quickly. Sometimes I feel like once you spend a really long time working on like a dissertation or something, it can feel like, well, unless I've studied this thing for 8 years, then there's no way I can do it. I'm not qualified. But to me, one of the lessons of this is that When you're working against the clock and when you're working in collaboration with community experts, you just have to be not afraid to go ahead and like jump in. And even if it involves a lot of new skill sets, just be reliant on the expertise of the folks that you're working with to at least get started, to get your feet wet, and then to see what happens. And the other thing I would say is we did encounter real challenges, I think, early on with this kind of consistent academic interest on a very narrow set of questions about racial identity. And I guess what I would argue is that when as for especially for other academics, when you go to a community with a very narrow set of questions for yourself, you are always only going to find what you're looking for. But I found in this project that by working with community members and giving them a platform to tell their stories, it's opened up an enormous array of really important historical questions about trans-Pacific networks of belonging, about Chinese cultural preservation, about foodways, about the surprising history of civic leadership and athletic success among Chinese communities in the South that I think wouldn't have been known to me if we didn't approach this project in a way that gave freedom to community members to kind of define um, their own narratives and their own stories. So yeah, so just a very quick update on kind of where the project is going. We're continuing to move forward. We've hired more undergraduate interns who are conducting new interviews, trying to map out, provide kind of some geospatial information about Chinese stores in the South. One of our next projects is to develop a digital database of Chinese burial sites throughout the state, which are very crucial for genealogical researchers. And if you take nothing else away from today, I hope it's simply that, you know, Arkansas history is Asian American history, and Asian American history is Arkansas history. And I don't know how many people on the audience today are in red states, but in a moment where I think so much of our conversation is about sort of diversity as a ideology or a goal, I think it's useful to simply remind ourselves that diversity is just the lived reality of our communities, and it has been the reality for a really long period of time. So, all right, thanks so much.
Thank you so much, Emmy and Zach. I really appreciate having an opportunity to hear this story. Again, I think such an important history that probably not a lot of people know about. And I also really appreciate those two takeaways about not being afraid to jump in. It's like you want to do that with humility, but you also just don't want to be paralyzed by what you don't know or what you're afraid to try. And I think also the piece about allowing research questions to expand, I think about that. My background is in community-based participatory research. And I think about that a lot when I teach research methods and how I was taught research methods, which is this very sort of like a neat way of going about doing research. It's very clean and very straightforward. You have a research question and that never changes, and you use the right methods and the right approach to analysis to answer that research question. And in reality, especially when you're engaging with the community, giving those research questions spaces to breathe and to grow as you engage with community partners and draw on their knowledge and expertise, that's huge. That's so helpful. And I think something that people aren't always taught to do or think about when we're sort of training up researchers. So I love how you all articulated that. So we will have time for some questions at the end, but I do want to pivot now to our next team. If I can get my slideshow to move. And this is Penn and Minnie, who are going to be talking about their collaborations between Tufts University and the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative.
Great. Thank you so much, Sarah. I'm going to just get our slides going as I'm bringing these up. All right. Can folks see the full screen of? Great.
Yes, we can.
Excellent. Thank you. I also just wanted to thank Emmy and Zach. This is an incredible project that you've all got going on. And also being Chinese American firstborn in this country, it's amazing to know the diversity of experiences in my own community. And I look forward to getting to really diving into the resources that you've created. So thank you for that. So I've got Minnie McMahon with me, and we will take a little bit of time up front just to introduce ourselves and the setting. So as Sarah said, we contributed a chapter to this book that really is looking at a pretty long-term community university partnership between Tufts and the Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, which has been going on for over 3 decades now. And our own involvement, of course, is a little bit more recent than that. But I'll start with just saying that, I've been teaching at Tufts in the Department of Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning. We're a professional master's program. And I've been doing that since 2009, but I come into this work not as a trained academic. I don't have a PhD. I came into it because I had been a community partner. I had been with a community-based environmental justice organization in Boston for a long time before coming into the teaching role that I have now. And I had the, privilege and honor of really having a chance to create the university partner that I always wanted when I was on the community side of that partnership. And so we're going to take you through a little bit of what that has looked like and talk about some of the lessons learned and some of the challenges and tensions along the way. So I'm going to start with a very short story about something that we considered a success. So going back about 10 years now, in the spring of 2016, I had an opportunity to be presenting about a project that I and a student team of 5 had been doing with a set of community land trust partners in Boston. And as we'll be saying a little bit more about, community land trusts are a form of collective ownership of land that helps take land off the speculative market and allows communities to better control development. And so Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative has long been one of those examples and a premier example of an urban community land trust that's been around since the 80s. But by 2016, lots of communities in Boston wanted to create community land trusts to fight against gentrification and displacement for permanently affordable housing. And we were able to, as a university team, help contribute a report that was being featured at the launch of the Greater Boston Community Land Trust Network. So I had a chance to be speaking at this in a community hall, and over 100 residents, community leaders, city officials were in attendance. And we got to present some of the findings of the report that the students had put together, basically talking about what the benefits of a community land trust could be for cities, neighborhoods, and families. And one of the things that we were really excited about was that as a university, we were helping to raise the credibility and visibility of this model with the city and funders, that we were able to actually do a project that was timed with our academic calendar, which doesn't always happen, so that the launch event was happening basically with the culmination of our spring semester. And the students really had a chance to get to know the partner and feel like they were able to do something meaningful to help this process along. And so this was part of a whole process that I had been going through at Tufts UEP, our department, to try to deepen our community partnerships and strategies. And I'll just say a little bit about what that has looked like, because we dealt with a lot of common kind of university community challenges, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with: elitism and exclusion, research that's exploitative, the devaluing of community knowledge and expertise, having to work within short-term academic timeframes, and of course, inequitable sharing of the benefits and costs of these partnerships, and also the fragmentation of what universities do in the teaching, research, and service. So we tried to pursue and part of our work with Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative has been developing and piloting this model that we call the co-research, co-education partnership. So it was really out of trying to deepen our community partnerships. A lot of that work was done with Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, where we said, let's do cycles of 3 to 5 year intensive engagements. Our engagement is primarily with a single partner where we can integrate teaching, research, and practice. And as this diagram shows, this is kind of a participatory action, research, action reflection cycle where, we can do joint inquiry, try to figure out what it is that we can do together. We can develop projects, and then we can evaluate and reflect on that and do the cycle all over again. And if we're able to do this over several cycles, then we're talking about maybe that there could be institutional transformation and coevolution in place. And so that's kind of the very short and quick intro to kind of the partnership model that we have been developing. I'll say a little bit more about that model in just a sec, but I'm going to pass it over to Minnie so that Minnie can introduce herself.
Thanks, Pen. Good afternoon, everyone. So I have to, thank you, Emmy and Zach, for your beautiful work and presentation. Really exciting. I'll look into that later. But just briefly, I was a student of Penn's. I am currently, when I was in graduate school at Tufts, I'm currently the director of the Greater Boston Community Land Trust Network here at Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. So I've had the experience as a Tufts UEP student and as a community partner in my role today. And I'll just say a little bit about my background. I was mostly farming in my 20s and had some, experience working for a small business, working for an organic farm in a big ag world, working for a farm that had a long-term lease, but not a super long-term lease on the land of wealthy landowners. So there were sort of land security and tenure questions. There were labor and equity issues. But the folks doing the hardest work were Mexican harvesters, packers, really doing the hardest labor. And the management were largely white Americans getting paid more, right? Doing sort of less backbreaking work, getting paid more. So that was some context on my farm, where I really wanted this project to succeed, but there were all these serious insecurity and equity issues going on. And then the town as a whole, there was quite a bit of, there were conservationists, there were conventional farmers, there were tourists, there were old school folks who had been there for generations, and just a lot of questions about power and ownership. So thinking about land and resources and place, and do you decide to dredge the creek or not, and who benefits, and who gets to make those choices? So sort of like literal ownership of land, housing, resources that we can work with to sustain ourselves, but then ownership of process, voice, and sort of place writ large. So that led me to graduate school. I was interested sort of in more systems level rather than just at one farm, but still human scale. So I was a UEP student under Penn, and really learned quite a bit of theory, but always coupled with that theory in Penn's way of teaching is case studies, at the very least, real life examples, case studies, and then, but also in community practicum class where we had a partnership with DSNI to try to support a major community planning process that was happening in the neighborhood of DSNI. We did documentation, we went to meetings, we sort of did some analysis of process, and also sort of our documentation work also helped advance the process. So I've been in a couple different roles, first as a UEP student of Penn's, and sort of researcher, practitioner, and now we've engaged Tufts University, from my position in some of our work with the Greater Boston CLT network, in particular in recent years. Pass it back to you.
Thanks, Minnie. Just to do a real quick summary of, we did a 3-year intensive engagement with Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative between 2016 and 19. We actually had a formal written memorandum of understanding. We had a formal kind of co-governance model. We agreed on equitable funding, which mostly involved Tufts providing some actual financial resources to Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative, to value the time that their staff were putting in to helping to conduct research and guide students and all of that. We decided we would focus on community land trusts and food economy as what we would be working on together. And then we strung together a whole bunch of different things. Minnie already mentioned the practicum, which she took, I think, I don't know if you were in the 2017 version of that, if I can remember correctly. All of our master's students have to do field projects where they work in teams every spring with a real world partner. So DSNI and the Community Land Trust Network have been consistent field project partners over the last decade. We were also able to support for a number of years summer internships. And then a number of students also turned around and did their master's theses focused on the work that they had started with our partners. And then finally, we also did a Teaching Democracy Popular Education Train the Trainers program as a brand new curriculum that was co-created between our department along with Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative and 2 other community partners. And I'm not going to go through all of this, but to say that, the outcomes of what we've been doing over a long period of time have included, people have now flowed back and forth between UEP and Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. Minnie is a good example, but we've actually had 3 other graduates who've gone into different staff roles with Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative. On the flip side, we've had Dudley Street Neighborhood Initiative staff come into complete our master's program for mid-career students at Tufts. Oftentimes, the thing that gets missing from community university partnerships is, the outcomes for students and researchers is usually pretty clear, right? You can get publications, you can sometimes get funding for research, but what the changes and what the benefits are for the community partner are often a little bit more nebulous and vague. In this case, contributing to the launch of the Greater Boston Community Land Trust Network has been great, and Minnie will be able to share a bit more about how that network has evolved and changed, and our continuing collaboration with them. But we were also able to produce curriculum, like I said, the Teaching Democracy, as well as this practicum, where we're basically, putting together a learning experience that also is enabling students to develop things that will hopefully, learnings that will help the field. And I guess we'll spend the rest of the time now just talking about lessons learned, and we're going to flip this a little bit back and forth. Minnie, I think you want to expand on the first point?
Sure. The first one is maybe also a little bit nebulous, but so we have here relationships are the means and ends for CUPs. So thinking, so like Penn said, different parties will have different interests going into these relationships and arrangements, and of course, advancing projects that are important to the community should be one of those top shared interests. And some of the work of breaking down the institutional barriers is also a worthy goal, right? That's what everyone here is interested in participating in some way. And you just can't do it without the relationships. So it's not that the relationships are the goal, but they're essential to building trust and having these long-term partnerships. And I think when you have that trust through the relationships, you recognize that you're actually in something together. And so that your institution might be different, or your group or whatever might be differently impacted than the university. by a certain something happening in the environment, but you are both indeed impacted. So to see yourselves as sort of both impacted by shared conditions, but then also agents in addressing shared conditions from different positions, but in partnership. And that can feel a little, vague. Well, what exactly does that mean? But if you have the partnership and you have a bunch of projects together, I think there's much more that is possible when you're coming in from that sort of shared framework and trust.
Thanks, Vinny. And I just wanted to add maybe that the mess of doing these partnerships that Sarah had mentioned always operates through these relationships. So, all right, I'll take the next two kind of together. So, co-learning is a way that we've been talking about how we've been doing work together, and trying to value our community partners as co-creators. And that, there are a lot of different places we can draw from that are already in university spaces, but that are often fragmented. So we've pulled together, the fact that we're a professional master's program where students actually want to get applied experience is actually super helpful. And there's also different parts of our university that are really into service learning and civic engagement. And, so we've been able to draw on those resources as well. And then on the research side, there's all kinds of models, community-based participatory research, participatory action research, and all kinds of variants of that, that folks are doing all over the place. And so it's not for lack of, having examples or models. I think the challenge is more or less, how do you put that all together in a way that honors the integrity of each partnership, right? Not every partnership has to evolve its own goals, and those don't always match the predetermined ones that either a community partner or a university partner might go into it with. We talk about equity as in kind of three dimensions: distributional and procedural. So we were very careful to make sure that if we got any additional funding, that it would be, basically 50-50. And then procedural equity, the co-governance, was very important to us. And then we have just one more slide here to talk about some of the tensions and obstacles. And Minnie, do you want to take this first one?
Yeah, so the institutional agreements being important but limited, because, presumably, ideally, there's benefit to longevity. I think that's an assumption here in the relationships. You learn and grow together over time. Things are going to keep changing, right? That the organizations change, the leadership changes, the momentum in a project shifts. In any group, whether it's a nonprofit or a community group, whatever, and also what the university's priorities are. So being able to have memoranda of understanding where that's valuable and sort of documentation of like, actually institutionally, this is a partnership we care about, right? Like sometimes you need that sort of thing to point to, but also understanding that the structure, having a organic, evolving, flexible structure is really key, because like Penn just said, different projects are going to have different goals, and you have to be open to how those goals evolve for each project. So yeah, the adaptation, I think adaptation, patience, and having an eye on short-term goals for the community partners, but also patience with the partnership over time. We've had periods of relative stagnancy that actually I don't think have hurt us, because we're in good relationship.
Thanks. I'll just spend a minute on this last one, which is that I think our deepest seated challenges are around epistemic justice, right? So kind of breaking down the knowledge hierarchies that I would say, universities are often part of creating, putting themselves at the top. If you go back to the initial example that I presented, where, I got a chance to present our findings at that community meeting and the launch of the Greater Boston Community Land Trust Network. There were some subtle things that happened in that. I was asked to do that, and then I was put in a position of speaking before any of the community partners. And so there was this weird thing going on where the community partners wanted a university voice to be kind of providing a front for them so that they could have a more, they wanted more credibility with the decision makers and funders. And at the same time, what that did was, perhaps inadvertently uplift the voice of a university researcher over the actual community knowledge of the actual residents and practitioners who actually generated all the work that that we were able to rely on in the university. So, so recognizing that has taken and how to break through that, is and lifting up that dimension, we feel like is a really important thing that we have to constantly kind of check ourselves on. And I think with that, I'm going to stop because we're probably over time and would welcome questions.
Great. Thank you so much to Minnie and Penn. I think this project is super fascinating, or this relationship is super fascinating. And I think especially it's so telling, one of our editors of the volume, Karla Bird, really, as we started thinking about this book, pushed us to think about the importance of relationships and trust, and really shifting our thinking from like just collaboration to like meaningful, deep relationship building. And that's so much of what is happening in this particular partnership. And just lovely, I think, hearing about that flow back and forth between, the community partner, the institution, folks in, going to Tufts, folks from Tufts, taking positions with the community agency. It's just, I think, really speaks to the quality of the relationships. So I know we're close to time, and maybe I would defer to Nicole if we can go over just a couple of minutes if folks do have some questions.
I will say, as long as folks have questions, slash maybe a couple minutes over. So feel free to ask the questions and we can stay a little longer.
Great, thank you. Does anyone have any questions they wanna throw out to either of our teams? Or you can feel free to stick them in the chat. Like a quiet audience, which is fine. I know we covered quite a lot of ground today. Okay, well, in that case, oh wait, we do have, let's see. Oh, Penn has a question for Emmy and Zach. Sorry, my chat went away. How do the undergrads experience their work on your project?
Yeah, so I can speak a little bit to that. So UCA is an institution where, a huge number of our students are Pell Grant eligible. We have a lot of first generation college students, and we have students who are from the Delta. We have a very small percentage, I should say, of students who identify as Asian American. Um, but there have been these really cool opportunities. So, like one of the interns on our project was a Korean adoptee who grew up in a small town in Arkansas. And it was really meaningful, I think, for her to talk to someone who was, 65 years her senior, but who dealt with kind of very similar experiences, kind of growing up, being the only kid in his class who looked like him. And so that was really special. I've also had students from towns in the Delta who don't identify as Asian American, but who have said, this is the first class I've ever taken that talked about my hometown. And so I think, when it comes to kind of thinking about community expertise, I think there's also an opportunity there to think about the community expertise of our students who are sometimes themselves from geographic spaces that are marginalized or underrepresented. Um, and also just this is like super practical, but I remember when we launched the museum site that the students had built with IMI, when the museum opened, a lot of students like brought their parents to see it. And I just like, I don't know, I don't remember the last time my student like showed their parents an essay that they wrote, you know? And so I think there's just kind of like really basic stuff about that, about feeling pride in the work and having it be kind of tangible in a way that's meaningful, not just to the community, but to the students too. That's been really cool. So thank you for that question.
Thanks. Any other questions from folks?
I guess I also had a very quick question for Pin and Minnie. I really appreciate what you said, Pin, about like not wanting to lose sight of the community goals for the project. And I feel like while in some ways like your partnership is so well developed and so kind of well articulated, the kind of forces that you're up against in terms of like gentrification and the long-term impacts of like, I don't know, late stage capitalism on land use feel often insurmountable. And so I guess how do you kind of make space for community outcomes that feel uh, meaningful, or how do you kind of establish those intermediate goals so where you don't just kind of become overwhelmed by kind of the problem?
Yeah, thanks for that, Zach. I could talk a long time, but I'll say very quickly, and I do am curious what many thinks too, that a lot of the work that I've done with community partners has really led to my focus on solidarity economy movements, where things like community land trusts are just gateways and openings for really trying to do things differently than the dominant world has done to us. And so this idea of collective, ownership over land and stewardship, and I think it's also important for me to not kind of get too wedded to some really big ideas that are really compelling, about building other worlds, for instance, because folks like Minnie are now connected to the work where it's like people actually need housing now, and have to deal with the fact that real estate speculators are coming in and buying up stuff for ridiculous amounts of cash. So I don't know, Minnie, what your thoughts are on how do you keep it real and not overwhelming or depressing.
Well, I'm glad you said what you said, and I think at DSNI and with many many others, that distinction between sort of transformative work and everyday services or needs, like we don't. It's not a very helpful binary to get into because we live in the everyday, all of us. This is life. So having that working for this community to meet the needs of this community just on all these different levels, and that's long-term visionary work, and that's some of that day to day.
Great. Thank you. We have maybe just one more minute left, but we did have a question in the chat if maybe one person or maybe two people can jump in with like very succinct advice. What advice would you have for folks starting community engaged work and trying to share that value to higher ed administration, especially in red states? I feel like that could be like a whole other conversation.
I'll just say very quickly that one of my long-term challenges as the director of our Asian Studies program was how to create opportunities for experiential learning for our students. Uh, I think traditionally within Asian Studies program, that's been done through study abroad, but it's just financially inaccessible for the vast majority of our students at University of Central Arkansas. And one of the really rewarding things about this project is that it's been able to give students in our Asian Studies program internship experience, kind of hands-on learning experience, and community-based service learning, I think is a model that, although the administrative structure at my university doesn't always appreciate the community goals, I do think that they understand the value of practical skill building and experiential learning, particularly within like humanities disciplines. And so it actually has been a great way to kind of demonstrate how Asian studies and Asian American studies can provide a pathway for students to develop. Uh, I don't want to say real world skills because, we're all in the real world. And I think the kind of efforts we make to build empathy in our students are also real world skills, but the kind of things that are, I guess, more visible to the epistemic structures of higher ed.
Yeah, sometimes we have to find those kind of back doors in
Mhm.
spaces where it's difficult to get this work done, for sure. Perfect. Thank you. So we are at the end. I did just want to remind folks our next webinar is Tuesday, August 11th at 2 o'clock. One of our co-editors, Suchi, is going to be facilitating that conversation, and that's going to be looking at sustainability and institutionalization. Again, I think some of what we talked about today really flows nicely into that. So I hope you all can join us for that. And lastly, again, if anybody's interested in buying the book and reading these stories, you can find the QR code and the discount code on the screen. Thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. Emmy, Zach, Minnie, Penn, really appreciate you taking the time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.